everyone, this is Amy Johnson Crow, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week we are going to be talking about finding your Mr. Right, working with common names. And I want to make sure from the outset that we're all on the same page. When I say that we're going to work on finding your Mr. Right, we're really talking about names. We're not talking about finding your actual Mr. Right. So, not to confuse this week's live stream with, daytime reality TV. Just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So, with a maiden name like Johnson, like I have, I've come across working with quite a few common names. And I know how challenging it can be when, when it seems like all the records that you're looking for, how do you sort through them? And that's what we're going to be talking about today is when you're working with a common name like Johnson or Smith or Miller, or, just when you have something that, you're not sure how to wade through when you're getting hundreds and hundreds of results, or how can you be sure that that record you found really pertains to the person that you're looking for? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So, has this ever happened to you? You've been doing some research and you add a new person to the tree. Let's say that you add John Johnson. And you go and you do a search for John Johnson, and you end up getting 65,272 of them. That's a little too many to go through. I don't know about you, but I don't have time to go through 65,272 John Johnsons, and those are just the ones that are in Ohio. So, how in the world can we narrow this down? How can we get something that's more meaningful to our research? Let's start by doing a little exercise. Think for a moment how you would describe yourself. You've met someone, or let's say at work, you have to come up with a little biography, maybe a little resume. So, how do you describe yourself? How do you identify yourself? Just think about that for a moment. I bet that some of you started out with, "My name is." Okay, that's a perfectly good place to start. But there are other ways that you can describe yourself. I was born such and so date in such and so place. I'm the child of these two people. I'm the sibling of some other people. I'm the spouse of someone. I'm the parent of someone. I went to school at this particular school. Here's my occupation. I have or have not served in the military, and I belong to whatever group. I belong to this particular church. I belong to this particular fraternal organization. Those are all ways that you can describe yourself. Those are all ways that you can identify yourself and how others might identify you. So, how does that play in with sorting through common names? So, what's the point? Just as we are more than our names, because we just went through a whole list of ways that we can identify ourselves and how others can identify us. Just as we are more than our names, so are our ancestors. They are more than just a name. So think about how else you can identify that ancestor that has a common name. And how you can think about other ways to identify that person will have an impact on how you can search and when you are evaluating new information that you found. So when you're searching, three of the main ways that these other ways to identify someone can come into play are with dates, locations, and relationships. Let's start by talking about dates. So let's say that you want to find John Johnson in Ohio in the 1940 census. There are 852 of them. And again, I really don't want to go through all 852 to find the one that I'm looking for. So how else can I describe him? How else can I identify him? Well, the one I'm looking for was born in 1905. So when we are looking at the search screen on archives.com, besides just putting in the name, I can also add a birth year. And what I like to do, especially when I'm looking through the census, is I like to give myself a little fudge factor, a little bit of wiggle room, because you don't know exactly how that age is going to be recorded in the census. It can easily be off by a year or two from what you would expect. So I can go down and add down in the birth year, I can add 1905, plus I can give myself a little bit of wiggle room. In this case, I've said that I want to search for John Johnson's in Ohio, born in 1905, plus or minus 1 year. So that would include 1904, 1905, and 1906. And when I do that, I go from 852 results down to just 37. That's a lot more manageable. Also think about place. Now, obviously, when you're working in the census, you're going to think about residence, but also think about other events. Where were they born? Where were they married? Where did they die? That can have an impact no matter what type of record group you're working with. So let's say that I'm looking for a marriage record of William Miller. Well, as you might expect, there are quite a few marriage records for William Miller. In fact, I just did a search this morning on archives.com and found 17,898 of them. Again, I really need to narrow this down. So I think that the William Miller that I'm looking for was married in Texas. So what I can do on the search screen on archives.com is I can add that. I'm looking at marriage records in all collections, but I want to narrow it down to just those marriages that happened in Texas. And when I do that, I take it down to just shy of 2,500. So it did narrow it down considerably, but I still need to narrow it down even further. And a great way to do that is by date. Based on the census, I think he was married in sometime in the 1880s. So if I add a marriage date of 1885 plus or minus 5 years, that covers that time span and it takes it down to just 17. Again, that's a number of records that I can work with. When you're working in the census, you can get even more specific, and this is a great way to narrow down searches when you're working in the census. So remember we had our 37 John Johnsons who were in the 1940 census in Ohio, born between 1904 and 1906. Well, let's say that I think he was living up around Cleveland, Ohio, and that's Cuyahoga County. So what I can do is here on the search, I can add Cuyahoga to the county. Now, what's really neat about this is that I still have all 37 results, but the ones for Cuyahoga County have now come up to the top. So I don't have to go through all 37 to find just the ones in Cuyahoga County. They're there at the very top of the list. Another way to search for someone with a common name is to not search for them. Instead, look for the unusual. Case in point, Well, this works well, especially with the census, because you're going to have other people in the household. So ask yourself, when you're looking for John Johnson or William Miller or, any common name, who else should be in the household in that census that I'm looking for? Is there someone there with a less common name? So instead of looking for John Johnson, maybe I'm going to look for, Missouri Johnson. Yes, one of my ancestors actually named some of his daughters for states. So, is there someone else that I could sort of piggyback onto to find this guy or gal with a common name? Case in point, looking for George Smith in Virginia in the 1940 census. There are over 500 of them. So even when I narrow it down based on his birth year, which was 1910, again, giving myself a little bit of fudge factor, there's still 43 of them. And I don't really have a good idea of what county he might have been living in. So, yeah, I could go through all 43 George Smiths that I have in my results list, but he should have had a daughter named Oneida in the household. So instead of looking for George Smith, how about looking for Oneida Smith? So that's what I did. So when I searched for Oneida Smith in Virginia in the 1940 census, I found two, including one with her father George, who was born in 1910. And here we have the census record. Here we have George Smith, age 30, which makes his birth date 1910, which is what I was looking for. And then down here is his daughter, Oneida, and she's age 12. So instead of going through all of those George Smiths and trying to find the one I was looking for, I instead looked for someone in a household with a more unusual name. Also looking for Lorraine. There are probably fewer Lorraine Smiths than there are George Smiths. So, just think about those other people in the household. Is there somebody who might be easier to look for? You might have heard this expression if you've been doing genealogy for any length of time, and that is to move from the known to the unknown. And what does that really mean for us? Well, it means to take what information you know and apply it to what you're trying to find. And it's not only part of the search process, as we've seen so far, but it's also part of the evaluation process when you've been looking at different records. Taking what you know and applying it to that new piece of information. You're moving from the known back to the unknown. If you were with us a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about timelines and how creating a timeline can make a really great tool for finding records and for evaluating records, you might remember this example. We had George Cassidy, and he had lived in Oregon in 1930 and 1940. And we suspected that he lived in either Illinois or Utah in 1910. Well, in the 1910 census, there are 19 George Cassidys in Illinois and one in Utah. So, how did I know that I had found the right one? There are 20 different George Cassidys in these two states. How do I know that I found the right one? And that's usually the question you have when you're working with common names. How do I know that this record with this name pertains to my person and not someone else with the same name? Well, when we looked at this particular census from 1910, this particular George Cassidy, and this was in Salt Lake County, Utah, I looked at his age, and it was consistent with what I had seen in the other censuses, as well as the age that I expected for him based on his death record. His place of birth was also the same from what I expected based on the other censuses and his death record, but also looking at the other family members, looking at his wife, looking at his two daughters. These are the exact people that I expected to find with him in 1910. So if I had had another George Cassidy, say that was born in Illinois, approximately 24 years old, but instead he had a wife, Mary, and sons, Robert and John, I would probably not think that it's the same person. But when I'm looking at this record in total, I have everything all put together. His age, his birthplace, plus his other family members all seem to match. Okay, and a few final words. Working with common names is not impossible. It does take a little bit more work. You do need to be methodical. You can't jump around. You have to really adhere to that working from the known back to the unknown. Use those other pieces of identification to your advantage. Thinking about other dates that you can associate, places you can associate, and other people, spouses, children, parents, siblings. Any way that you can identify that person, use those other pieces of identification to your advantage. And finally, keep in mind what you know and compare it to what is in that new record. That will help you determine whether or not you're looking at the same person. All right, next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to talk about what are you missing in death records. I love working with death records. There aren't too many groups of people where I can say that and they understand death records are awesome. But are we really using them to their fullest advantage? So that's what we're going to talk about next week. What are you missing in death records? Next Wednesday, April 17th, at the same time, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, I encourage you to stay connected with archives.com. You can follow a lot of different things that we're doing on our blog. Be sure to like our Facebook page. For those of you who are on Twitter, please follow us on Twitter. We are at archives.com. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you've already discovered this, but all of our previous live streams have been uploaded to the Archives YouTube channel. So for those of you who are watching this live, and maybe you've missed some live streams that we've done in the past, please take a look at the YouTube channel and you can watch all of those there. For those of you who are watching this live, I will be popping over into the chat room momentarily to answer a few questions that you might have. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, please join us on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern for more great genealogy topics. Until next week, this is Amy Johnson Crow. Happy researching.